Hello, this is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hello.
Today we are discussing The Garlic Ballads by Muller. This is the last book in our series, Life Under Communism. Previously, we reviewed and discussed László Krasznahorkai's Satantango and Herta Muller's The Passport. You can find those episodes in our archives. If you want to find us online, I don't know why you would, but if you want to, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at our Canonical Pod. Next week, we will continue our series with another discussion of the Garlic Ballads. We hope you'll join us for that one as well.
So you have done the math, actually, James, and you found out that we have done, 10% of the writers that we have talked about are Chinese.
About 10%, sure.
About 10%, yeah. And when we talked about those Chinese writers, particularly Liu Cixin and the three-body problem, a listener actually criticized us, and he said that as Western readers, we focus too much on China and censorship rather than focusing on the entertainment value of the novel. Now, with this novel, I think it's a bit different. I think this novel is more clearly political, and I think it's more clear that Muller intended it to be political. But for you two, how much did the novel's potentially adversarial relationship with Chinese state power factor into your evaluation of it?
As far as how much we enjoyed it?
How much did you focus on that? How much were you thinking about that when you were reading?
I felt like it was hard to not consider at any given point. But that doesn't mean I was thinking about it all the time, if that makes sense. One of the things I said in the review episode was that it kind of strikes the same note. We talked about how that note is more or less government bad, peasants good. So yeah, it's always forefront in my mind, but it wasn't an important note. It wasn't an important thing that really got me thinking.
Well, as someone who is sympathetic toward certain libertarian ideas, reading about, how did you put it, an adversarial relationship to state power kind of gave me a boner. So does that count as factoring into my evaluation of it? I would like to say, though, that I didn't really care if it was the Chinese government or not. That actually didn't matter. I think the fact that it is about peasants and an oppressive local government, that's pretty interesting. And that's similar to a lot of other kind of satirical comic novels that we've seen. Maybe not for this podcast, but we've come across generally writers like Kafka, right? That have to deal with difficult bureaucracies, convoluted bureaucratic processes. That kind of book is in some ways inherently interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also I agree that, at least for this discussion today, I'm not particularly interested in this book as a Chinese book or whether or not it means that China is good or bad. I think that's a much longer discussion for another time. But what I am interested in is how being adversarial encourages censorship, or it encourages the discussion of censorship to come up. And that brought me to an article by a critic called Thomas Chen. And what he does in his article is he takes on Western readers' interest in the idea of a censored dissident novel in China. And what he does is he analyzes the 4 Chinese language versions of this novel against the English version translated by Howard Goldblatt, the version that we read. So just very quickly, the original text was published in 1988, and it was very soon thereafter banned in 1989 for reasons unknown. And later, in 1989, a second Chinese language version was published in Taiwan province. And then in 1993, China unbanned the novel, and there was a new edition published in 1993. The English translation followed in 1995, and finally, after quite some time, Mo Yan returned to the novel, perhaps for the final time, with a new Chinese edition in 2009.
Man, this is reminiscent of our discussion of László Krasznahorkai's Satantango publication history.
When I say it's an edition, I don't mean it was just reprinted, but rather there are substantial differences between all of these. And to me, it was actually quite surprising how substantial the differences are. I want to take a look at the English version a little bit later, but two things stood out to me just among the Chinese versions. In the 88 and 89 versions, there's a quotation at the beginning of the novel, and it's marked "words of a famous person." Now, this quotation is at first attributed to Joseph Stalin in an excerpt from the novel that was published in a literary journal in 1988. It was also attributed to Stalin in the English edition, but in the afterword to the latest 2009 text, Mo Yan actually writes that he didn't get this quotation from Stalin, but rather it's just something that he dreamt Stalin said, which I think is a very candid sort of admission. The next thing that I thought was quite interesting in a similar way is the 1988 text says that the novel is fiction, and any resemblance to the real events that happened just a year earlier is purely a coincidence. Then, the 2009 text affirms, in fact, that the novel was based on the 1987 Garlic Glut, which is completely contrary to what he said at first. So I guess the bigger issue for me is, do these revisions actually challenge anything about the way that you conceive of a literary author or the way that you conceive of a literary text?
Yeah, you don't have the text of how he described that any events that seemed like they were reminiscent of something real was just a coincidence. You don't have the actual text here, but in that essay, it sounded pretty tongue-in-cheek. I don't have it right in front of me, but it sounded very insincere, the way it was written.
Right.
Well, that's what Thomas Chen says. He says that when Mo Yan writes that this was not based on the Garlic Glut, Thomas Chen says that he says it in a sort of subversive, jokey way.
Yeah, here. This book is purely fictional. If unfortunately it has similarities to a certain incident in real life, this is a random coincidence. The author does not bear responsibility for the feelings and health of those who automatically jump to conclusions.
So the argument that Chen is making is that this is clearly a joke. But then I have to wonder, is this a joke that was prompted by somebody else? Or is this a joke that Mo is making at the expense of the government and at the expense of the presupposition that his novel would have been censored?
I don't have an answer for that. But to your question of whether these revisions challenge anything about the way we conceive of the author or the text, we seem to have discussed, this idea of a never-ending text. Like at some point, we expect a work to be finished, but because of numerous revisions or republications, especially if an author likes to tinker, we end up getting multiple products and versions. And I believe you, Ed, found that to be annoying because you want there to be a fixed completion where a certain version is the finished version. And I seem to remember that you don't like this kind of tinkering that a writer does, setting aside the censorship aspect. Like, a writer who republishes his book with a new ending, would be very annoying for you.
That's true. I have said that before, but I think that the reason why I bring it up again now is because now it seems that censorship is the potential cause of this. And I think what's at stake for me here is really the value of literature as an art form, because one of the reasons why we study literature and read it carefully is because of the idea of close reading as a practice of serious reading. And if a book can be changed ad infinitum, how does that change the possibilities for close reading? Is close reading still valuable in a work that is only temporary or a work that is only contingent?
Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that, but what I'm wondering in terms of its relationship to censorship, whether it matters at all that a writer changes it because of censorship or because he just feels a need to edit that one last paragraph or change the ending or whatever. Like, does that matter at all in terms of close reading?
I think why it matters here is because this is just one of the knock-on effects of censorship that people have not noted before. Like in his article, Thomas Chen doesn't bring this up as an issue, but I think it's substantial. I think that it matters to me, certainly.
Yeah, I think, sort of generally speaking, to my mind, it doesn't really matter what the cause is for these edits, because no matter for what reason, if a writer starts changing what the text says, for whatever reason, for whimsy, because of outside pressure, whatever reason, that actually makes it difficult for us to have a close reading, because I think there's always a sense that our close reading might be modified in the future because the author is inserting his own interpretation, right? I feel like that's the risk to close reading, because if you feel like an author will always tell you you're wrong or you're right, then you kind of feel like what you're partaking in is a bit unnecessary. Censorship, I think, has that effect as well, but maybe it has different knock-on effects.
I think this is a unique case. I know we've talked about this before, but I feel like it is unique in that there aren't that many books that go through changes like this, especially not this many changes. So it makes for an interesting case study.
I mean, I'm not even sure if that's true. I don't know of other books that have had this kind of publication history, but perhaps it happens more frequently than we know.
It could. It's funny that you bring this up this week when I just heard a story recently about how Anthony Burgess, the writer of A Clockwork Orange, that book had at least a couple different versions, 2 or 3. It also was changed for US audiences, and that it was radically different. So it does make close reading difficult, especially if meaning changes through the version changes. And it seems like some of the changes here have changed meanings for the book. I feel like the notes being struck are still the same, even with the changes. But the changes that Chen talks about still are pretty significant in what they convey.
I think that we need to talk more about the quotation because that to me is not to be glossed over. So,
yes,
the quotation to me, I think, is significant because one of the ways that I think about the literary author is a person who is making an intellectual statement and putting himself out there and standing behind something that he has said. And perhaps this is not the most charitable way to read this, but when Moyen publishes this as this is something that Joseph Stalin said, and then later on he says, oh, in fact, he didn't say it, and I just dreamt that he said it. How is this distinct from lying? And if he is offering us a work of art or an intellectually substantial work, and then we find out that he has potentially lied, how does that affect the way that we regard him?
I think it casts a bad light on the rest of the work, even though it doesn't need to. But I think it does. I think the quote is an interesting quote. And then when you find out, I certainly didn't know that it was a complete fabrication until reading this essay. I'm inclined not to believe him that it was something he dreamt. It seems too convenient for it to be something he dreamt. It seems to me like it was just something he thought it would be very nice if someone as reviled as Stalin said something like this.
Yes.
How about I stick this in as Stalin?
I think that it matters in the Chinese context specifically because I think in Chinese literary culture, quotation is much more important than it is in America. And it's very common for a very literate person to have memorized lots of pithy sayings and to bring them up at the right moment.
That happens in this book, in fact.
Yeah, for him to have just the right epigraph for this novel is substantial. So when Chen says, perhaps this is more of a metafictional thing, his argument is that Mo Yan puts this at the beginning of the first chapter as part of the fiction, rather than separate from the rest of the novel. I think Chen is being very, very charitable. I honestly think that there was something for Mo Yan to gain by fabricating this, and it was revealed in Chinese context that, hey, this is not an authentic quote. But then Mo Yan and Goldblatt decided perhaps together, well, let's put it back there for the American readers. Those foreigners don't know anything anyway, so we can fool them at least.
So that's interesting because I did not come to that conclusion. So you're saying that he's using it for some kind of cultural cachet and that he's purposefully lying.
I'm saying that the possibility exists, and to me, just if I apply kind of Occam's razor, that seems to be much more likely the case than the case that Chen describes.
See, for me, Occam's razor is he seems like someone who has a certain sense of humor. And I think we did disagree on this in the previous review episode. I did think like that he's someone who is trying to be funny at certain points. And I could see this as being like a joke. That's how I understood it. Like when I was reading Thomas Chen's description of the differences. Like I could see him kind of poking the eye of the censor and of Chinese sensibility, because Chinese audiences would expect a pithy saying, but what if he lied to you?
Why was it removed and then replaced? Why would that have happened?
I don't know why it would happen, but it's actually not like Occam's razor for me. The interpretation that he's doing it to fool Western readers, like that would not be my first thought. Like that wouldn't be my like most simple explanation for it.
So James, I'm going to ask you point blank then. Besides, making a joke at perhaps the censor's expense, what is the point then in lying to his readership, his Chinese readership?
I mean, this is not the first book we've read with a fake epigraph, right? Was it Pale Fire? There was another book we've read where the writer falsified a quote at the beginning.
Maybe Pale Fire, but Pale Fire is a very different book. I mean, the whole thing is a fabrication. So
yeah,
I don't know if that counts, if that is indeed the book.
Well, my point is, it's not without precedent. I think you could certainly read it and say, okay, he's been caught out in a lie. But I think you could also read it and say, oh, he's doing it on purpose. Like he has always intended to give you a false quote. And he's just playing around with how to attribute this quote. Because the first version did not have Stalin, right?
No, the first version that was published before the novel was published did have Stalin.
Yeah, what was the very first one? It's his words of a famous person. That's not Stalin.
No. So in the Literary Journal in 1988, it was published with Stalin's name.
Mm-hmm.
In 1988, when the novel came out, and in 1989, when it came out in Taiwan, it was words of a famous person.
Okay.
So the first time it was in the public's eyes, it was with Stalin's name on it.
Yeah, I mean, like, for me, knowing the history, the most simplest explanation I can come up with, which isn't the right one, I'm just saying the most simple one, is he thought it was Stalin, and then it turned out not to be.
Oh, that he got it wrong?
Yeah, made a mistake. Like, he thought it was actually Stalin. Like, that's the most simple explanation, is like, he found a quote, and he's like, oh, this is from Stalin. And then someone's like, no, it's not from Stalin.
Yeah.
And then he's like, oh, okay.
But then why is it in the 1995 American version? Why does it come back? Making a mistake is not a problem, but making a mistake and then not correcting it, that's the problem.
If it is a mistake, I mean, maybe it is just a saying that is hard to find anywhere else. But if it is a mistake, I looked up the quote and couldn't find anything that didn't direct back to the Garlic Ballads.
I kind of feel like this is devolving into like a conspiracy video on YouTube where like for me it's like, well, what's the big picture here? Because like my reading of it is it doesn't really matter, because I think you can always understand it as maybe he made a mistake or maybe he's doing it on purpose, but we don't know. I mean, how do we know, right? So what's the significance then?
Maybe not. But I mean, I think the significance is that this isn't the only change.
Yeah, I mean, I would even say this is the least interesting change for me. The ending is way more interesting.
Yeah, let's talk more about the ending. This occurs in the differences between the English version and all of the other Chinese language versions. The larger point that Chen is making is that these two differences change the way that we understand censorship. First of all, there is an additional chapter about Zhang Ko, the blind minstrel. And in that chapter, he's threatened by the police and then later murdered by the police. And then all of the Chinese language editions have a chapter that includes some state media style newspaper coverage of the Garlic riot. So by replacing the media chapters with the Zhang Ko chapter, what Chen is implicating is perhaps Goldblatt and Mo Yan's American publishers made these changes in order to attract an American audience, an anti-China audience. And what he is saying here, Chen is saying, is that how can we really distinguish editing and translation and criticism from censorship?
There's different ways to understand this, because you can understand it as just like appealing to the audience, right? And it's not censorship at all. That he's making the change because he thinks American writers will appreciate it more. And in some ways, that's worse. If that's the reason why he made the change, I actually would think less of him. The idea that he might be doing this because of censorship is more interesting, but I don't think that's as supported, because I don't think either version is more censorship friendly. Like both of them are indictments of the state. One is more ironic and you have to read into it more, like the tone of the newspaper articles describing the riot contrasted with what you know as a reader what happened during the riot and the real story of it. That's quite compelling, actually. And it doesn't really make the government seem less culpable in any way. It's, in fact, a denouncement of the Chinese press, but it's much more subtle.
I think it is possible that both types of censorship can be true in this case, but I think I agree that it seems likely to me that certain changes were made for the benefit of selling more books in the US. I would be unsurprised if that became the truth, if that was found to be the capital T truth.
Now, if we come to the realization that his American publishers exerted financial pressure using that kind of power in order to change an artistic creation created by Mo Yan, is that different from censorship in any way?
A little, but not much. I don't think it's a distinction that matters that much. I think where it does matter is that, at least in my understanding, it would be more voluntary on Mo Yan's part. If it became a sort of blackmail thing, like, well, if you don't make these changes, then we're not publishing it, that's something else. That does become censorship. But I don't know if that would happen, at least quite like that.
Well, I'll use an eadism here and begin my response by saying the truth is that all writers censor themselves.
Sure.
I mean, I think we like to imagine that some writers are really speaking truth to power and they're not afraid of anything. But all writers self-edit and censor, right? So what's important is the reason why you censor yourself. Because if you're censoring yourself to protect the state or to uphold some kind of injustice, that's worse than censoring yourself because of sales, which is worse than censoring yourself because of artistic sensibility. I mean, I think most people would agree to that kind of sliding scale spectrum, right? Like if you're censoring yourself for sales that's crass. If you're censoring yourself because you think writing this is stupid and this story told this way is stupid and I shouldn't do this because my audience's estimation of me will drop, I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, writers do that all the time.
The place where I start to disagree with you is if you are creating this hierarchy and you place upholding some state injustice as worse than marketing and selling books. Yes, but if making that change to sell more books, you are lying about something, manipulating people's feelings about another place, or to be specific, manipulating Americans' feelings about China, then maybe it's not just as bad, but you're edging in on that territory.
Sure. I mean, my greater point is that the reason for censorship matters, not just censorship itself, because everyone censors themselves. But I think another thing worth considering, and I think this is quite important, is which ending is actually better artistically. Because I would argue that the newspaper ending is not as good as the ending where the minstrel dies. Because if you think about it artistically, the book doesn't really take on state media. It's not a big theme in the book. What we see is a reporter that goes and tries to take advantage of this juicy story of an arranged marriage and the woman committing suicide. Like, that's all we get about state media. And then at the end, you throw in kind of like an image about how state media is obscuring the truth. I mean, I don't think that is as resonant as state brutality, which is throughout the book. And I think if you look at cohesiveness of theme, that is way more cohesive to my mind, even though it's less subtle.
James, the truth is that self-censorship cannot be considered as a species of censorship in general. They can't be considered the same things because self-censorship always requires somebody to have been convinced. When you decide to censor yourself, you have weighed the stakes and you've decided, you've been convinced to do something. When other people use power to censor you, it often doesn't matter if you've been convinced or not. So for you to say that perhaps Moyen is censoring himself, that means that it doesn't matter really much if his publisher has censored him or his country has. To me, I think it makes a very big difference.
Okay, but do you think that he could have adjusted his ending because his American editors told him, well, this doesn't work as well? Like, there's an artistic reason to make the change.
Yes, that's why I don't agree with Chen's basic premise that any kind of change that happens with a different editor is censorship, because to me, the important distinction is always about coercion and consent. And if his editor says, listen, this is what we would like to do, and Moyen says, yeah, that's fine, that's a very different case than what I would imagine the Chinese government can do to Moyen. Regarding your second point about which ending is better, I almost feel like it doesn't really matter if what you're saying is that we should be happy with the changes that the American editors have made because it makes the novel better. Potentially, yes, but isn't that kind of beside the point?
It's beside the point if our discussion is focused on censorship and what causes it and the fallout from it. I think it's not beside the point if you set that aside and consider perhaps he changed it for other reasons, like he's a tinkerer. Because he could be just the kind of writer who can't let go, who needs to keep on making director cuts.
Yes, potentially, but then again, I would dislike the novel for the reason that I mentioned before, where it doesn't establish the quote-unquote official text, the original text. That, to me, I think is substantial. If we're going to read text closely, there has to be one text that we all look at. Especially to deprive people of access to that text because they come from one country rather than another is especially unfair.
I think the last thing I have a question about is you said that internal censorship is obviously different, but is that different from internalized censorship? Because that happens, right? Where writers know that because of the political climate, they cannot write certain things, which is what I was getting at. Like in China, you can't write certain things. So even though you don't have someone outside your apartment watching you like they do Ai Weiwei, you know that you can't write certain words and you have provided the filter yourself.
Right. But Iad's point was that that's still different from someone taking a big black marker and saying no. Someone crossing something out and making you change what you say without your acceptance is different from you choosing, you know what, I might not be able to say this.
I think it would require us to know more about how people consent in situations like this, and whether or not they feel some sort of incredible burden when they are choosing not to do things that they would perhaps like to do. I think that there are times, sure, when it is like that, but I think that there are many more times when it's much more subconscious, and the self-censorship happens just because you're just trying to get along and you don't think about all of these things that you can't do because you're thinking about the things that are important to you because you can do them.
This kind of self-censorship is insidious. I think in some ways it feels like we're making light of it because I feel like that's obviously a form of pressure from the state, because otherwise you would not be censoring yourself. This is what I mean when I say it's a difference in degree, not really of kind.
Normally, when people use this phrase, poisoning the well, they're talking about a rhetorical fallacy, saying that nothing can be good because it comes from a bad place. But when we talk about Chinese censorship, has China really poisoned the well? I think in the article by Thomas Chen that we have been discussing, he claims that foreign readers are consistently doubtful of the accuracy or sincerity of writing coming out of China when that kind of doubt is unjustified. But if that doubt happens, whose fault is it?
I think this is a tricky question because I think we have real examples of China being directly at fault. But Chen gives us a pretty convincing argument that maybe China is not always to blame, especially currently. Maybe China's not on the censorship button as much as they used to be. So maybe the fault isn't always with them. Maybe the fault is something foreign born. Like maybe this is coming from Goldblatt or American publishers.
When you create a situation where people frequently cannot say what they would like to say, and when people say what they would like to say and then it's very quickly erased, when that type of climate is the norm, will doubt ever be anything other than pervasive?
I think my response to this, and also to your previous question, is actually very similar, which is it is very hard for Americans to visualize that because we don't live in the same political climate that someone like a Chinese person who has to endure this kind of censorship lives under. And because of that, we have a preconception of what it's like to live in that world. And I say this as all three of us have lived in China, and all three of us have interacted with people in China. I think that there is, perhaps not now so much as before, but definitely during the Cultural Revolution, there's this idea that you have to be careful what you say, because saying the wrong thing could get you imprisoned or killed. Like, we don't know what it's like to live in that kind of atmosphere. We can only hazard a guess. And because we don't know, I think when we read someone who comes from that kind of background or setting, we maybe will read it with some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration of their plight. And so to the second question about why would we not always be doubtful, or perhaps why we would be doubtful, I feel like people would, because especially if you take it to an extreme, like during the Cultural Revolution, when the consequences of saying the wrong thing is death, I think people would have this kind of mistrust of what's being said, of society in general. But once again, I think I'm kind of projecting because I didn't grow up in that situation. So it's hard for me to say.
I think that a writer like Chen would like to reorient the West's view of China and have us have a perhaps more sympathetic view of China. But I just don't know if it's really possible at this point because of the way people already understand China and its government. But also, I think there is a distinction, and I'm not quite sure what it is, between the way that Chinese government agents censor their population and the way foreign governments censor their population, because it's not a specifically Chinese problem. But this doubt is much more prevalent in China than anywhere else. So, what is the distinction between censorship in that country and censorship in our countries?
Maybe the overtness, which, when you think about it, is kind of scary. For sure, there are things that get censored that we probably don't know about or don't think about that are less overt than the kinds of censorship we're talking about here with China. And maybe that is more insidious than something more overt, something more instantly noticeable.
So I said earlier how we don't live under the same political climate, and obviously I still think so, it being just a few minutes later. But I do think that it is interesting to consider whether or not the media in the US is analogous in some way, because when you look at echo chambers, I mean, Fox News is old news now. Now it's Newsmax, which is like Fox News taken to the extreme. I mean, people who are not in the bubble, they automatically discount anything that happens on Newsmax. So I don't know if that's similar in that way, because it's not censorship per se, even though they give you a filtered version of events.
Right. It's not like you can't go outside of that and find out other perspectives.
You can say it's the same in the sense that because they use such an obvious filter, you could say then that you can only blame them when people who are not regular viewers will always doubt everything they have to say. Because they have established a reputation for being liars, of course they should expect that everyone will regard them as liars.
Yeah, that's the analogy that I would make. But it's not similar in other ways because it's not the state doing it. I think that's a pretty important distinction.
Does it matter, though? Is the corporate censorship or quote unquote censorship that we have in the US really different from state censorship in China? Would it be fair for readers outside of the US to constantly doubt everything that we have to say because we're Americans?
I think the difference is the access to multiple points of view. And even though being in an echo chamber limits your ability to trust other points of view, it's still available. So if you are in the Newsmax echo chamber, it is still possible for you to get news from CNN. But if you're in China, you can get news from China Daily, or you can get it from Global Times, which I think is even more nationalistic, right, than China Daily.
Yeah.
Like the news is either very censored or even more censored. So you would not really have the access. I think that's quite different. The question really is, and this is kind of getting far afield, when you're in the echo chamber, is it actually possible for you to really consider alternative news sources and alternative facts? If you're so deep into the Newsmax bubble, can you actually see CNN and internalize it as truth? Because if you can't, then no, it's not different from being in a state with heavy censorship. On that note, we'll stop here. If you thought we were off base with our discussion, you can let us know on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. You can always give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with another discussion episode on the Garlic Ballads. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.